Gooshbagz. Welcome into the Week 12 edition of the Gooshbagz Fantasy Football League podcast. This one is going to be off the chain because I've got a skeleton outline. I'm playing fast and loose this week. Who knows what's going to come out of my mouth this week? So it's going to be crazy. It's going to be quick. It's a quick week this week because yesterday I was busy last night. I didn't have time to put together much of an outline. I did what I could right before I started tonight, but we're just going to see how it goes. We have a short week. We have 3 games on Thursday, I believe, for Thanksgiving. So, and I'm busy tomorrow night. So, I'm just trying to throw something together for you guys this week. It's going to be good. It's going to be fun. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of a rant. My team, my fantasy football team, is chocked full of studs. On paper, I have one of the strongest teams in the league, and it frustrates me to no end. I mean, I did have Dalvin Cook on a bye this week. I did have Kyler Murray on a bye this week. I did have Keenan Allen on a bye this week. So this week was a little bit of a skeleton crew for the scary Terrys. It was quite scary. But somehow every week, my lineup just goes wrong. I have Keenan Allen and Cooper Kupp, 2 of the top wide receivers in the league. And now, Keenan Allen doesn't know his ass from his hands. Chris Carson fumbled twice this week. Now, neither of them showed in the fantasy numbers. He only had 7 points, but he fumbled twice, and now his job is somehow in jeopardy. The Rams' offense is shitting itself every week, and I don't know. I'm still somehow technically in the playoffs right now. So I was looking at this, and I know, Neil, you wanted a playoff, some playoff speculation, some playoff scenarios. I don't have all of that information. I didn't have a lot of time to put that together. Hopefully I can do that next week. But I am currently, if the season ended today, I would currently be in the playoffs because I'm tied with Team Auto Pick, but we are 1-1. We've played each other twice, and I beat him the first time, and he beat me this week. And I have the next tiebreaker is points 4. So I am currently in the playoffs. So if I win out, then I'm definitely in the playoffs. So I just got to win out. I have 2 tough games ahead of me. I'm playing against Adam next week, and I would say that was an easy week, but nothing is an easy week the way my team has been playing. And then the next week, I believe I am playing Ryo, so that could be a tough game. Ryo's been putting together a few good games recently, so he could go on a tear against me. But I'm sorry, that's just my rant. I'm very frustrated with this fantasy football team because my team is fantastic. My team is great, but they just can't put it together. They can't do it. I don't know. Nobody plays well together at all. Anyways, back to the Chris Carson news. He might be losing his job. Like I said, 2 consecutive fumbles, and that chode Rashad Penny had a 60-yard touchdown run. And he had more carries in the game. He had more carries before Chris Carson fumbled those 2 right in a row. And I don't know what to do. Like 4 weeks ago, I was like, there's no way Chris Carson is ever losing his job to Rashad Penny. But somehow, it's in contention. I don't know what happened. Chris Carson has been a beast, and he just had a rough game against a tough Philadelphia defense. Or they have a very good run defense, not so good of a passing defense. And Rashad Penny took advantage of like a giant hole in the offensive line and had a 60-yard touchdown run. And then the Rams offense, I touched on this a little bit, but they suck. Anybody who has a piece of the Rams offense, especially this week, knows what I'm talking about. Jared Goff looks like shit. The Rams offense doesn't know anything. They don't know what they're doing. Cooper Kupp had 6 catches this week on, I believe, 12 targets for 35 yards. They scored 6 points against Baltimore. I don't know if that's just Baltimore's defense. They have been good recently, but I don't think they're that good. And you'd think that they would be passing the ball way more. when they're down so far. I just don't know. I don't know. All the wide receivers were untrustworthy this week. I don't know what to tell you. They just sucked. Anyways, I'm sorry about that rant. The top scorer in the league this week was obviously my opponent. Try and stop me from auto picking. He had 130.1 fantasy points. I thought I had this week in the bag going into the matchup. Obviously, Chad, if you were listening to last week's episode, he mentioned that he thought that Team Auto Pick was going to win, and he was right. He went on and put up massive numbers this week, Team Auto Pick. So congratulations. I'll get you your $10 tonight. And I'm sorry that you couldn't join me this week. I was restricted on time, and I know every day of the week is free except for tonight for you. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get it to work out. But I am going to get you on, James. James, you're going to be on this podcast whether you like it or not. So I'm going to move on to the studs of the week. At the quarterback position, Lamar Jackson. Quarterback 1 of the week. That's not a surprise. Although what is surprising is that he had 36.3 fantasy points, but he only had 169 passing yards. But he threw for 5 touchdowns. Who does that? Obviously Lamar Jackson. He's insane. I feel like I'm talking about him every week because he's always in the studs category. 169 passing yards and 5 touchdowns. He also had 8 rushes for 95 yards, so that helps. He had an extra 9.5 points because of that. So it's always great to have Lamar Jackson on your team. Unfortunately, you won your week, Neil, but you didn't get the top score in the league. All right, all the rest of the studs for the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The next 7 studs are not people who should be in this category. Ryan Tannehill, Sam Darnold, Jameis Winston, Baker Mayfield, Kyle Allen, and Ryan Fitzpatrick all came before Drew Brees, which is the next big name on this quarterback schedule. So it was the week of mediocre quarterbacks doing awesome, except for Lamar Jackson. So Ryan Tannehill had another big game in Tennessee. He's been fantastic. He had 32.4 fantasy points. Sam Darnold put up a big game. He had 28.2 points. And Jameis Winston, despite throwing 2 interceptions and tearing apart my Atlanta's defense, he threw, or I don't know how many points he had. Let's take a look. I don't have it all up here. He had 24.3 fantasy points, so he was fantastic. That was a crazy week from a whole bunch of average quarterbacks, and I say average quarterbacks, but they're all in the NFL, so they're all good quarterbacks. Just compared to others in the NFL, they're not so great. And these quarterbacks, all the mediocre quarterbacks have great schedules going forward, and actually the high tier quarterbacks in the NFL have the toughest schedules going into the playoffs. So these might be the guys that you want to look to, even though it's scary to play them over your high tier quarterback. They have great matchups going forward, and those might be the guys that help this playoff push. In the studs category for the running backs, Leonard Fournette, because of course, he was playing me. Why wouldn't he go off? He had 32.4 fantasy points. When I needed a small night from him and a big night from Cooper Kupp, of course he goes off. And Cooper Kupp, well, I've already talked enough about the Rams offense. So, of course, Christian McCaffrey, 29.8 fantasy points. That's enough talking about him. I talk about him every week. He's a beast. What more do you want to say? Derrick Henry, running back 3 on the week, and he has been great over the last 4 weeks. He had a bye in there, so the last 3 games he had have been fantastic. He had kind of an average beginning. He was getting scores, but not very many yards, and he wasn't being used in the passing game. He finally he's stepped up his game over the past 4 weeks, and he's been looking like a very solid option in the second half of the season winner. At the wide receiver category, Chris Godwin had 33.9 fantasy points. He had a massive game at Mike Evans' expense. He tore up Atlanta's defense, who I shouldn't have played this week, but I did. So he's looking great again. He's on again, off again with Mike Evans on the field. So He's always prone to have good games, but he can also give you a pretty low floor too. So you kind of got to take the highs and the lows with Chris Godwin. Jarvis Landry. He was the wide receiver 2 on the week. He had 31.8 fantasy points. I'm going to say this, and it might not be a surprise anymore, but he is the number 1 wide receiver in Cleveland. OBJ, he sucks. He's awful. No, he doesn't suck, but he's clearly the number 2. Baker Mayfield loves looking at Jarvis Landry, especially in the red zone. He's been getting hella red zone targets, and he's been scoring on them. So good for you, Jarvis. It's about time that you're fantasy relevant. I believe I mentioned in maybe the draft episode or something. I was talking about how like you like Benaya was talking about how he didn't like that you were fantasy relevant, Jarvis. And Jarvis, you proved him wrong. You are fantasy relevant when you're actually playing with an above average quarterback in an above average scheme. Okay, I don't know if that's true about either of those things, but he's been the number 1 target and he's been fantastic, and he's proven to Adam Gase, who was the Miami coach back when he was in Miami. He's proven to Adam Gase that he can run more than a 10 yard in route or a 5 yard out route. He can catch more than that. So good for you, Jarvis Landry, for being fantasy relevant this year. The wide receiver 3 on the week, DJ Moore. He had 28.4 fantasy points. He's the number 1 in Carolina as well. Everybody was talking about him and Curtis Samuel. DJ Moore has been getting the consistent targets from Kyle Allen every week, and he's been really consistent over the last 4 weeks. He's been a great guy to have, a solid wide receiver 2 to throw right into your lineup. At the tight end position this week, it was kind of a tight end wasteland. Outside of George Kittle and Zach Ertz, who had 21.9 and 21.1 points. By the way, it's great to have George Kittle back. Besides those two tight ends, there were awful tight end scores this week. I mean, you're talking about the tight end 5 had like 50 yards, and that was it. Let me take a look real quick. I had this up earlier. So the tight end 4 was Mike Gesicki, and he had 10.3 fantasy points. He had 3 catches for 28 yards and a touchdown. He was a tight end 4 this week. Tight end 3 was Jared Cook, so that was good for him. He had 18.9 fantasy points. Tight end 5 had 17 yards. He was Caden Smith for the New York Giants, 17 yards and a touchdown. Tight end 6, Logan Thomas. Nobody's heard of him. He had 2 catches for 24 yards and a touchdown. It was a crazy week for tight ends, and it shouldn't be a surprise, but you'd think you'd have a little more names that near the top of that list, but outside of George Kittle, Zach Ertz, and Jared Cook, there was nobody that anybody had on their teams that played decent. So it was a rough week in general for the tight ends. In the duds category, QB1 of the duds that we played this week was Matt Ryan. He had 7.6 fantasy points. He had no scores and 1 interception. Although the team did score 22 fantasy points, they had a rushing touchdown by some unknown running back, like the backup to Brian Hill. And then Young Ho Koo, my man, had 3 field goals and 1 extra point. So, he had 3 field goals. He got him 9 points, and then they must have scored a defensive touchdown or something. No? I don't know. I don't know how the scoring went in that. I had it up. I'm not sure. I don't know how they got all of their points, but Matt Ryan was not involved. So he had 200 and something passing yards, but 1 interception, no touchdowns. So Carson Wentz was dud number 2 in the quarterback position this week. Him and Russell Wilson battled it out for a very low scoring game. Russell Wilson only had 9.5 fantasy points. Carson Wentz had 8.9, both on opposite sides. And that was it was a tough defensive game. It seemed like I didn't watch it, so I don't know that that's true. But there weren't too many points scored, and that's just that. I don't know. It was kind of a surprise. That was kind of a matchup that could have gone for big points, and just kind of disappointed. So at the running back position this week, Aaron Jones. Well, no, we're gonna start at the bottom. James White had zero point 0.4 fantasy points this week. That was a defensive battle for New England against the Dallas Cowboys this week. I think it was like 9-13 was the final score. And let's see. Yeah, no. Where am I at here? Here we go. No. Yeah, 9-13. Dallas lost. So that was a rough game, and it was a defensive battle and not the greatest game script for James White. That's usually more the Sony Michel game, and I think Sony Michel did have a lot of touches in the game, so they just didn't have much passing opportunity for James White. They weren't down. They didn't pass the ball too much, so it was just kind of I think they kind of ran the clock out most of the game. I don't know. Ryle probably knows better than I do, but I didn't watch it. But that's just, I'm assuming, what happened in this game. Todd Gurley had 3.4 fantasy points. The Rams looked atrocious. Like I said, I don't know if it's just Baltimore's defense or just the Rams not knowing what they're doing anymore, but something is going on in LA, and it's not looking good for the Rams. Sell low. Whoa, there's no more selling. You could drop Todd Gurley off of 3.4 fantasy points. Just kidding. If you dropped him, I'd pick him up. But yeah, I don't know. The Rams offense the last like 3 weeks has just not looked good. So I don't know what's going on. Something in the water. Maybe there isn't any water in LA. That might be the problem. But Aaron Jones. Let's go back to Aaron Jones. He had 3.8 fantasy points. My God, San Francisco looked good. Now this was a game I did watch. San Francisco is so aggressive on defense. I was talking about this today with some guys at work. They could have 7 guys in the secondary on defense because their front four gets so much pressure on the quarterback. I feel like every time Aaron Rodgers dropped back, there were 3 of the 4 rushers on him already, like within 2 seconds. It's insane. I don't know how they do it, but they just looked amazing. And anytime he got a pass off to the wide receiver, the defender was within a yard of every single wide receiver the whole night. They did not get any yards after the catch. They caught it and got tackled immediately. They looked aggressive and they looked good. So, that San Francisco defense, I had not had the chance to watch them before. They look so good. They looked really good. At the duds at the wide receiver position, Emmanuel Sanders only had 2 fantasy points. He just wasn't involved too much in the passing game. Only George Kittle really did a lot, and then Debo had 2 catches. Debo Samuel had 2 catches and a touchdown, I believe. Other than that, I think Emmanuel Sanders, just kind of had a rough week this week. He had 1 catch for 15 yards. So Amari Cooper in that New England game, he got goosed. He didn't get hurt in the game. He just got shut down by New England. I watched a little bit of this one. He did have a pass near the end that he almost caught that was originally ruled a catch, and it went through his hands and hit the ground as he was falling to the ground, and so he didn't have possession of it. That would have been a good play, but didn't quite have it. And then I believe there was another catch that he had that was called back on a penalty. So he got on. I mean, it was only two plays that he would have gotten points on, and Amari Cooper just got that. New England, their defense specializes in shutting down the number 1 option, and they force you to get beat by somebody else. So when they shut down Amari Cooper, they had a tough time playing some offense there. And then Cortland Sutton was a dud this week. He had 3.2 fantasy points. That Bills D was tough. And Brandon Allen looks awful at the helm. I don't know if they're going to go back to Joe Flacco. I think they should. Because Brandon Allen does not look like the future of the Denver Broncos. So we're gonna have to see what the Broncos do going forward, but I really don't think that Brandon Allen is the guy. Maybe they'll just let him play it out because they know they're out of contention anyway. We'll have to see. At the tight end position, Vance McDonald had 0.6 fantasy points. He was a big dud this week. He only had one catch for 1 yard. Can't go any worse. Can't be any worse than that. I mean, you could, but as far as like getting stats in the playbook, one catch for 1 yard is about as little as you can do. Can't do anything with Rudolph at the helm. So they put in Devlin Hodges, and he looked much better. And maybe, as the rest of the season goes on, and maybe with Devlin Hodges taking all the snaps this week, maybe he will give him a little bit more value going forward. I don't know if Devlin Hodges is for sure supposed to start yet, but I think they should start him the way he played. He played much better than Mason Rudolph. So Jason Witten only got one fantasy point. I would just chalk that one up to the New England defense. Once again, they just got shut down, so they couldn't do much on offense in general. So overall, like I said, it was a rough week for tight ends. So besides the top couple, it really wasn't any good. Now, for the matchup reactions. Matchup number 1 was the Scary Terrys versus Try and Stop Me from Auto Picking. Despite his semi-auto picked team, Try and Stop Me from Auto Picking took down the Scary Terrys 130.1 points to 92.5. Now, like I mentioned before, he had Leonard Fournette getting 32.4 fantasy points. Oh, and I was wrong about this. Leonard Fournette did not play on Monday night. I insinuated that he did. Leonard Fournette played on Sunday, and he had a massive game. I needed Mark Ingram to have an awful game and Cooper Kupp to do well. But unfortunately, James rode his running backs to victory here. He had Leonard Fournette with 32.4 fantasy points, Mark Ingram with 24.3 fantasy points, and he could have had more, but he was taken out, and Gus Edwards was put in because they were just boat racing the Rams. So he got, he could have had over 30 points as well and been even better this week. But he also had Jarvis Landry. Team Auto Pick had Jarvis Landry go off for 31.8 points. For his duds, I mentioned Jason Witten and Emmanuel Sanders already. They both had rough games. Carolina surprisingly put up a fight against New Orleans this week. So New Orleans defense did not do so hot. They only had 4 fantasy points. Otherwise, the rest of his team obviously did pretty well. Curtis Samuel only had, actually, he didn't do so hot. He had 5.4 fantasy points. He only had one catch for 9 yards, but then he had 40 rushing yards. So that was interesting. He had, what was it? Oh, 4 rushes for 40 yards. Wow, he was really used in the rushing game. So he got a little bit more value out of the ground, but he was Team Auto Pick was led to victory by the running backs. All right, Team Scary Terrys, the studs on the Scary Terrys. Baker Mayfield had 23.6 fantasy points. I picked him up to play him against Miami, and that worked out pretty well. He did better than Josh Allen did, so I made the right choice for this week. George Kittle had 21.9 fantasy points. As much as I hated to see George Kittle and the 49ers roll over Green Bay, they won. George Kittle, I mean, yes, clearly the 49ers won, but George Kittle had a fantastic day, mainly on that one long touchdown pass. So that did good things for me. It wasn't quite enough because I was going against Jimmy Garoppolo, so they kind of canceled out. But, he scored more than Jimmy G, so I think it was worth it all in all. Just the rest of my team sucked. So moving on to the duds. Jamison Crowder only had 2 catches for 18 yards, so that sucked. He only had 2.8 fantasy points. And the rest of the team just didn't do great, and they didn't do bad. Cooper Kupp had 6.5. I talked about him. Philip Lindsay had 7.3. Philip, that is a bright spot on my team. He didn't have a fantastic day this week or game this week. They were against Buffalo, so that's a tough defense. But he is basically getting all of the carries in Denver right now. So I think going forward, he has a pretty healthy schedule. He's got the Chargers, Houston, Kansas City, and Detroit for his next 4 weeks, and those are juicy. So I think going forward, Philip Lindsay is going to be an asset to my team. At least I hope so, as Chris Carson's value seems to be declining. All right, matchup number 2. Big Ben's Bathroom versus Mix and Mac. Mix and Mac takes a surprising victory, 121.9 to 92.9 points. Beat him by 29 points. That's a big win. That is a big boy win. And it was led mostly by Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson on Mix and Mac had 36.3 fantasy points. I talked about him. Hyper efficient, super good. Chris Godwin, I also talked about him. 33.9 fantasy points. Fantastic day. Devontae Adams had a decent day. He had 15.8 points. Otherwise, his team really didn't do much. He had Joe Mixon go for 7.9. Alvin Kamara had a decent game, 14.7 fantasy points. And he actually had a negative points for his defense. Jacksonville's D had -3 fantasy points. They allowed 42 points to the Tennessee Titans, so that was no good for them. He still was on top by a hell of a lot of points, but if he had played a decent defense, he might have been the leading scorer of the week. Who knows? Or if he had played Jamal Williams instead of David Montgomery, or Jonathan Williams instead of David Montgomery, I'm sorry, he would have had a great game. But oh well. So his only dud was Jacksonville's D. Jacob Hollister for the Seattle Seahawks only had 3.2 fantasy points, but that's not that bad in the scheme of things this week for tight ends. Unfortunately, he went up against Big Ben's Bathroom, who had 21.1 fantasy points in his tight end position from Zach Ertz. However, the rest of his team did not really do much. Big Ben's Bathroom, Drew Brees had a decent game. He had 22.4 fantasy points, but he had Amari Cooper pooping his big boy pants over here. He had Saquon Barkley, who only had 7 fantasy points. He had Aaron Jones with 3.8 fantasy points. So the rest of his team just really didn't carry their weight, and so they lost. Had he played Allen Robinson over Amari Cooper, he would have gotten 22 of those points back. Actually, I don't know if even the ideal lineup would have beat. Oh yeah, he would have. Yeah, if he had played Devin Singletary instead of Aaron Jones, which nobody in their right mind would have done, and then Allen Robinson over Amari Cooper, he could have won. But well, that's just how it goes sometimes. The decisions you make could haunt us forever. Like all of my trades this year, that's basically how they've been. All right, on to matchup number 3. Zerline, I never hit you. You're tearing me apart, Lisa. Versus the running Mayfields. Zerline, I never hit you. Wins 96.7 to 71.9 points. He rode on the back of Derrick Henry, essentially, to get him the victory. Derrick Henry got Zerline, I never hit you, 28 fantasy points this week. That was a great game. Everybody else, Russell Wilson, I would count as a dud, 9.5 fantasy points. Everybody else just kind of had an okay game. Carlos Hyde at 6.7. He had 67 rush yards, so that's all he does. Darren Waller had 3 catches for 41 yards, got him 5.6 points. Those were the bad players on his team. Like, they weren't so bad. So he was kind of saved from just like average days for his team. So the running Mayfields, though, man, I don't know what to say. He played Jameis Winston, who had 24.3 fantasy points. He had a good game. Tyler Boyd and Odell Beckham Jr. had 16. Tyler Boyd, let's just talk about that for a second, because he's been not so great. But he had 5 catches for 101 yards and a touchdown, even with Ryan Finley at the helm. Before this, he hadn't gotten over 10 points in 5 games and 6 weeks. So good on you for sticking with him and playing him this week against a tough Pittsburgh defense. So I'm proud of you. And he ended up having a great game. And Odell Beckham Jr., despite being the number 2 in the offense, still had 6 receptions for 84 yards and a touchdown. So good for OBJ, good for Tyler Boyd. Unfortunately, they were the only ones that did anything on the team. Oakland's defense had -1 fantasy points against the Jets. Kind of a surprise, but Mark Andrews had 5.5, which is, pretty normal for the tight end scape this week. Cortland Sutton had 3.2 fantasy points. Gus Edwards had 5.5. He got a little bit of work in there at the end of the game since it was a boat race. And James White had 0.4 fantasy points. So he had a tough time. He had Devonta Freeman out, David Johnson on a bye, Austin Eckler on a bye. It was kind of a rough week for the running Mayfields in terms of buys and injuries and everything. He's kind of had a rough year in general. Moving on to matchup number 4. Josh Jacobs Jingleheimer Schmidt versus Rogers Cup. And Rogers Cup pulls this one out of their ass somehow to win 93.6 to 91 points. He was helped by his newly acquired Michael Thomas to the tune of 21.1 fantasy points. He had 10 catches for 101 yards and a touchdown. He has been the most solid wide receiver in the league, clearly the number 1. So good for you for picking him up. He was also helped by Ezekiel Elliott, who had 14.6 fantasy points. Everybody else just kind of had, average games. They were Jacoby Brissett at 13 points, AP 5 points, Sterling Shepard 6 points, Greg Olsen 6 points, Brian Hill 4 points. He was helped out by San Francisco's defense, who put up 13. So it was he kind of squeaked by the seat of his pants just past Jacobs Jingleheimer Schmidt. So the studs on Josh Jacobs Jingleheimer Schmidt. DeAndre Hopkins had 24.4 fantasy points. That was a big day. Finally, he's coming around and doing something the last couple weeks. He's been solid. Finally living up to that name, at least providing you with a safe floor. Ronald Jones had a decent game, despite, I don't think he got too much work. He had 12 rushes for 50 yards and a touchdown, and 3 catches for 16 yards. I mean, he didn't get a lot of work, but he was efficient with what he had. So, good on him. Hopefully, he continues doing that going forward. Now, unfortunately, Josh Jacobs Jingleheimer Schmidt had Carson Wentz at the helm, who only had 8.9 fantasy points. He also had Josh Jacobs, who that's kind of a big disappointment against the Jets defense, which hasn't really been a great defense. Oakland really struggled this week, which is very surprising. So I don't know if it was traveling across the country from Oakland all the way to New York, but it was just a rough week. Gerald Everett only had 3.3 fantasy points. Peyton Barber had 3.2. Oh, he played both Peyton Barber and Ronald Jones. He had the whole Tampa Bay backfield. Maybe that was the problem. Should have played Ryan Tannehill. You definitely would have won this game. But anyways, it was a well-fought battle and a victory for Rogers Cup. Now on to matchup number 5. One of the higher scoring games this week. Too Many Cooks, now named Too Many Cooks, used to be Brandon Cooks Kittlecorn, takes down My Tight End Hurts When I Fart, 117.2 to 106.1 points. Too Many Cooks once again jumped on the back of Christian McCaffrey. He had 29.8 points. He also had help from Jared Cook, who put up massive numbers this week compared to the rest of the tight ends. He had 18.9 fantasy points. Tevin Coleman had a decent game at 11.9. And, Pittsburgh's defense, who is going to be solid going forward because they play basically nobody. So, the bad games that he had, the duds on his team, Matt Ryan, who had 7.6 fantasy points. Mike Evans was kind of disappointing because you expected a big game against Atlanta. Instead, it was a Chris Godwin day. He only had 7 fantasy points, Mike Evans. And Jalen Samuels against Cincinnati, which you think would be a smash play. He only had 4.7 points. So that was kind of a rough week for Jalen Samuels, Mike Evans, and Matt Ryan, but he was still able to pull out the win this week. Now for my tight end Ertz when I fart, the studs on his team, DJ Moore, boom, 28.4 fantasy points. Talked about him. He's been great. Um, keep playing him going forward. Nick Chubb also had a huge game. He had 23.9 fantasy points against Miami. That's kind of a lock and load, shoot the running back out of a cannon sort of game. He had 106 yards and a touchdown that game. And Kareem Hunt, you also played a full backfield. Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb. I'm proud of you. Kareem Hunt had 11.6 fantasy points. Todd Gurley, unfortunately, was a dud for you this week. He had 3.4. Tyler Lockett had 4.3 fantasy points. He apparently did not look good. I didn't really hear too much about him, but he I think just didn't. I don't know. Maybe. Oh yeah, he was coming back from an injury, wasn't he? I think that was kind of part of the problem. So maybe it was just the first game back from an injury. Not doing so great, but yeah. So going forward, I don't know. My tight end hurts when I fart. You said a solid lineup, but I don't know what is. Oh yeah, he's behind me in the standings. So I hope you stay there. Actually, you can win as many as you want because I'm gonna win out. So not a problem. All right, now on to my favorite segment, as I say every single week. The waiver wire team that would kick all of our asses. The QB for this week would be Sam Darnold. He's been a beast the last couple weeks. Might be worth a pickup this week. Who knows? We're gonna have to see how it goes. He had 28.2 fantasy points. The running back one on this waiver wire team that would kill all of us was Rashad Penny. He had 18.9 fantasy points. The running back two, Benny Snell Jr., had 10.8 fantasy points. The wide receiver one was A.J. Brown with 21.5 fantasy points. Wide receiver two, James Washington, 17.3 fantasy points. The tight end on this team would be Mike Gesicki with 10.3 fantasy points. Hey, I had him on my team for a week. He didn't get me 10.3 fantasy points. At the flex position, Robbie Anderson had 16.6 fantasy points. He took all of the targets instead of my Jamison Crowder this week, so I'm kind of mad about that. But he's on this team, this beast of a waiver wire team. The defense, this is a huge surprise. The Redskins' defense and special teams had 20 fantasy points. Now that was huge. And then the kicker is Jake McLaughlin, who had 14 fantasy points. This team would have netted you 157.6 fantasy points. That is dopest. Dopest schmopus, as I say in the business. Once again, it was a win for the waiver wire. Now, on to matchup predictions for next week. I got to pull these up since I did not write anything about them. And those of you who know what I do for this, I usually write out the matchups and who's playing and everything, but I didn't have time for this, so I'm going by the skin of my teeth. Now, last week, I was 2 for 5, and Chad was 3 for 5, so not so great for me. Chad, once again, gets another W against me. Hopefully, I'll kick his ass in the playoffs. That's the dream, at least. But for this week, I'm putting another L in the L. I'll put another check in the L column, I guess. Unfortunately. All right. Excuse me. On to matchup predictions for next week. Matchup number 1: the Scary Terrys versus Rogers Cup. I predict the Scary Terrys are going to win with Kyler Murray, Dalvin Cook, and Keenan Allen back from bye. He's finally got his full lineup again, and he is just going to destroy Rogers Cup and his meager running backs since he only has Ezekiel Elliott as a main running back. So I think that Although he is getting Tyreek Hill back, he should have some good wide receivers, but you know, I think the Scary Terrors are going to take him down. Put it on the board. The next matchup number 2, Josh Jacobs Jingleheimer Schmidt versus Zerline. I never hit you. You're telling me apart, Lisa. Let's take a look at this lineup. He's got Russell Wilson against Minnesota, Derrick Henry, Indianapolis. Man, Zerline, I never hit you, has a great lineup this week. However, Josh Jacobs Jingleheimer Schmidt has Carson Wentz, who has been shoddy, but they're going against Miami. They got Gerald Everett against Arizona, which is a smash play for tight ends. Although DeAndre Hopkins is going up against New England, that could be a rough game for DeAndre Hopkins. I'm gonna have to go with Zerline. I never hit you. He's got better matchups this week, and yeah, I think he's got the better lineup this week. Zerline, I never hit you. I have you winning this week. Put it on the board. All right, the next matchup number 3. Too Many Cooks versus Mixon Mac. Now, Too Many Cooks has Nick Foles in his lineup this week against a rough Tampa Bay defense. As in, they suck against the pass, so that could be a smash play for Nick Foles. Lamar Jackson has San Francisco. Now that is going to be the game to watch next week. San Francisco versus Baltimore. That's going to be huge. Let's take a look. Devontae Adams against the Giants. David Montgomery against Detroit. I don't know if you're actually going to play him or not, but that's who Mixon Mac has. Mixon Mac has Devontae Adams. Chris Godwin against Jacksonville, who just got tore up by Tennessee's defense, so that could be really good. Joe Mixon. Mixon Mac has some pretty good matchups this week. But Christian McCaffrey is against Washington, and he's projected, get this, projected for 25.4 fantasy points. That is insane. And I bet he's going to beat it. He's going to beat that for sure. Yeah, I'm going to have to go. I'm actually going with Mixon Mac this week. I think that Mixon Mac can take down Too Many Cooks due to his great matchups this week. Yeah, and they're going to overtake Christian McCaffrey that will probably go ham, but I think Mixon Mac has got this one. So I have Mixon Mac winning this one. All right, matchup number 4. Big Ben's Bathroom versus Try and Stop Me from Auto Picking. All right, let's take a look here. Saquon Barkley is against Green Bay. That's a smash play. Aaron Jones against New York Giants. That's also a good play. And Drew Brees against Atlanta. Oh man, Big Ben's Bathroom has got great matchups this week. DJ Chark against Tampa Bay. I don't even have to look at Try and Stop Me from Auto Picking. Zach Ertz against Miami, Lev Bell versus Cincinnati. These are all fantastic plays. I think Big Ben's Bathroom is gonna be in contention for the highest scoring team on the week. He's got Baltimore's defense too, who has been fantastic. Yeah, I think Big Ben's Bathroom's got this one in the bag. All right, matchup number 5. My tight end Ertz when I first versus the running Mayfields. I think that the running Mayfields are going to lose. Oakland's defense is projected 0 points. Is that correct? They're projected 0 points next week. 0. So I doubt you're going to actually have them on your lineup, but yeah, I have my tight end Ertz when I farts team winning. I just don't think that the running Mayfields have enough juice. They have David Johnson's not the guy he used to be. Austin Eckler might have a decent game, but he's against Denver. Yeah, tough matchups and not a great lineup. I think that my tight end Ertz when I fart has got this one in the bag. So, well, thank you so much for listening, you guys. I'm glad that you were able to put up with me for I don't know how long it's been, 40 minutes or so. Yeah, 45 minutes. I've talked a long time just by myself. Thank you guys so much for listening. Hopefully next week I'm gonna try to get the playoff scenarios together. There'll only be 1 week left until the playoffs, so it won't be too difficult. We'll kind of see who's still in the running, who's not, and we'll take a look and see how it goes. So good luck to you guys this week, Cho Bags. I'll see you next week, and goodbye.